Welcome to a very special edition of JTV. We are here at Immanuel College, which is a Jewish school in London, and we're doing another session of Grill the Rabbi. We're joined by Rabbi Zobin, who is no stranger to JTV, and no stranger to Immanuel College, because he is the principal of Immanuel College. And we're going to be fielding some questions that the students have submitted, and we're joined by a group of students here this morning. So let's just jump right into some questions. So the first question we have is from Charlotte Adler. Where are you, Charlotte? Okay, great.
How do you justify the Jewish version of the creation of the world against the Big Bang?
So this is a common question that's asked with regard to people that believe in the creation narrative. How can you believe in both what science has to say about the creation of the world and the Jewish version of the creation story? The two don't really seem to match, or do they?
So first of all, thank you, Charlotte. That's really a great question. Perhaps if we contextualize the development of the current scientific theories of the Big Bang, currently science thinks that the world is some 14 billion years old, plus minus. But actually, if we look historically, certainly till the early 1900s and really till the late 1900s, the consensus had been for more than 2,000 years that actually the world was infinitely old, that it had always existed. It has existed forever and ever. So from the great Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and going forward, educated opinion amongst scientists and philosophers was that the world had always existed. So if you were a Jew in the year 1900 and believed in a world that had only existed for a finite amount of time, you were going against more than 2,000 years of consensus, 2,000 years in which the conventional wisdom was that the world had always existed. With the dawn of the 1900s, Einstein and his development of his theories, things began changing a little bit. And one of the consequences, for complicated mathematical reasons, of some of Einstein's theories of relativity was the possibility that actually we were inhabiting an expanding universe. That means to say that if we look at the universe the way it is, space itself is expanding outwards. Now, often when we think about that, we picture a room, and in the room there's a balloon, and the balloon is getting ever bigger, expanding into the room. But that's not what we mean by an expanding universe. What we mean by an expanding universe is that space itself is expanding, which is a difficult idea because one wants to cry out, what's it expanding into? And the answer is it's not expanding into anything because there is no space into which it's expanding. It's space itself that is expanding. Now, if we live in an expanding universe, a universe which is expanding, and we see it growing ever bigger, we can begin thinking about turning the clock backwards and shrinking it in on itself, till eventually it would shrink into one singularity, one single point, which we call nowadays that point from which it exploded outwards, we call that the Big Bang. Now, Einstein was a great thinker. Part of being a great thinker is that you can question the conventional wisdom, and perhaps Einstein, of all people, stands out as a person who was able to question conventional wisdom. He came up with ideas that suggested that space and time are continuum. He came up with ideas that time itself is affected by gravity and is affected by the speed that you're traveling. So he was someone that was willing really to question common sense and question that which has always been thought. But when it came to this idea of an expanding universe, he himself made what he later called the biggest error of his life, the biggest mistake of his life, and he wasn't able to accept that implication. Even for the great Einstein, going against thousands of years of consensus wasn't something you could consider. With the continuation of the 1900s, this theory was more and more widely considered, till eventually it was pretty much decisively demonstrated by an astronomer called Hubble, who actually picked up evidence, redshift, and evidence for an expanding universe. And it turns out that Einstein's theory was right, against the implication that he himself hadn't liked and tried to introduce a fudge factor to avoid that.
Why didn't he like it?
Because even for the Einstein, it was something that was difficult. It was difficult for him to question the consensus that we lived in a stable universe. And it turns out that the universe does have a start. It has a start in time and space. Now, the issue isn't fully closed. As you turn the clock backwards in time, the maths is very complicated. But certainly, mainstream conventional science, consensus scientific understanding at the moment now is that if you turn the clock backwards, you get back to a singularity in space and time. Now, we call it a singularity because at that point there's a breakdown in the laws of science. In fact, there's almost a breakdown in human vocabulary. When we want to ask, well, what happened before the Big Bang? The answer is we can't ask the question because there was no before. Because at that moment, time and space came into existence. And in the same way as space itself is expanding, and at that moment space came into existence, it didn't come into existence inside something else. But it was space itself that came into existence. Similarly, it's time itself that came into existence. And therefore, the language we use, the world of cause and effect, the normal regularity of science, in which we want a framework in which something causes something else, which causes something else, there's a breakdown in our ability to use that language. And here, actually, from a Jewish point of view, we're in a pretty good place. Again, if we were Jews 100 years ago, we would have to be adopting a position against what most scientists and philosophers think. They think we live in an eternal universe that has always existed, and we're maintaining we live in a universe in which space and time started. 2019, actually almost everyone agrees with us that we live in a universe in which space and time had to start. And not only did it have a start, it had a start which we can't give a material cause to, because material, matter, doesn't yet exist. In fact, quite possibly, as far as we understand, the laws of science themselves didn't exist. So we're talking about a first cause that transcends the laws of science, transcends the normal maths of cause and effect. A cause, a first cause that transcends the physical universe within which we live, actually sounds pretty much like what we've been saying all along. So this isn't a proof of God, but certainly science has arrived in a position in which we perhaps are looking for a first cause which transcends the laws of science, transcends time and space, not far off our picture of a Jewish God. In fact, if we look at classic Jewish sources, and they're explicit, absolutely clear, that with the creation of the world, it wasn't just the universe, the world that came into existence, but it was time itself that came into existence. So there we have ancient Jewish texts dating back 2,000 years or more, making the claim that we live in a world which not only had a beginning, which is the first pasuk in the Torah, but also with that world coming into existence is the creation of time and space itself. Time itself came into existence. If we ask, what was God doing before the creation of the world? There was no before, because God is above time, and with the creation of the world, time came into existence. So actually, in answer to your question, I think we're in pretty good shape. I think that the concept of a singularity, a point in which time and space comes into existence, a breakdown in the laws of science, in which science itself has arrived at the recognition that it doesn't have a framework within which to explain, a scientific framework within which to explain the existence of the universe, of everything, that's quite a Jewish picture.
Does anyone have a follow-up to this? These points that Rabbi Zobin has made? Anyone wants to ask a question based on that? I mean, I know I certainly have one, which is, Rabbi Zobin, you're suggesting that because science has now come to a place which recognizes that we need to have something that caused the Big Bang, the universe's beginning, that's outside of time and space and everything, that indicates that you have something non-physical that caused this beginning, which fits in with the Jewish concept of there being a God who created the world and there was a beginning to the universe. But how do we deal with, and perhaps this is a different question, but how do we deal with more specific issues within the creation story, like the fact that it talks about there being 6 days of creation? That doesn't really chime with science, does it?
There are 2 points I want to make about this. The first point is that, and this is important and maybe clarifies the points I was saying previously. I'm certainly not making a claim that the Torah is a book of science. Science tells us about how the world is. That's not what Torah really is interested in. Torah is interested in telling us how we humans ought to be. What sort of beings should we be? What should be our goals? What should we aspire to? How can we transcend our sometimes selfish and coarsely physical selves and achieve real worth and real meaning and things of spiritual and moral value? That's what the Torah is about. It's not a book really about science. In fact, so much, this is the case to such a degree that Rashi, the famous commentator on the Torah, on the very opening words of the Torah, Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning God created, and the whole description, the 6 days of creation, says, what is this doing in the Torah at all? Why does the Torah start with that? The Torah should start with the first mitzvah. The Torah is a book of mitzvot, of moral imperatives, telling us how we ought to live, what sort of beings we ought to be. So Rashi's bothered. Why is it entering into the domain of science at all? Why is it telling us anything about the world? A remarkable question. We take it for granted that, well, of course a religious text should tell us how the world came into existence and how it's created, but actually Rashi is saying from a Jewish point of view, that's really a question for scientists, that's not a question for theologians or rabbis at all. Of course, we do need to know something about the creation of the world. We do need to believe and understand that the world has a first cause, a God. But the details were not of particularly Jewish interest. Were we to want it to be a scientific text, we would have to ask ourselves, what would we want it to say? In the year 2019, maybe it would say, in the beginning, there was a singularity, a big bang, and then there was plasma. And the plasma coalesced into electrons and particles. And some 15 billion years later, a planet formed, Earth, on which life evolved. But would that have been comprehensible to people 3,500 years ago? And will it be accurate to people in 100 or 1,000 years' time? So the Torah is not a work of science in which it's going to date itself to any particular time or consensus scientific opinion at the time. What is it? It's a book that tells us what we ought to be, how we ought to behave.
It does say specific things about the creation.
Having said that, it does tell us specific things about creation, and now we need to check whether we've understood them properly. I don't want to go into a massive amount of detail because we need to look at texts, but I just want to make several points. The first point is that according to Maimonides, the days described in the Torah don't even refer to days at all. There is a problem over here. In halacha, in Jewish law, how do we define a day? In fact, in general day-to-day life, how do we define a day? Well, by sunrise and sunset. But when you're in a period of time in which the sun hasn't yet even been created, doesn't even exist, there's no reason to assume that the periods of light and dark that are described are controlled by the sun at all. The first day of creation, the second day of creation, third day of creation, Vayihi erev vayivoker, there was nightfall and then there was morning, but no sun yet. So we're referring to some other fluctuation of light, some other wave of light and dark which determines the passage of time. We have no idea what clock is being used to measure that passage of time. And the assumption that it's the sun during the 6 days of creation is certainly incorrect, because there was no sun for over half of that period. So what's exactly the length of 6 days of creation? We have nothing really that tells us clearly. More than that, the great commentator I mentioned before, Rashi, believes that the whole description of 6 days, and again this was written by Rashi not in 2019 with some attempt to reconcile science, the idea I said before, written by the Rambam, Maimonides, not some later apologetics to reconcile with science, but written hundreds of years ago, 800, 900 years ago, long before the rise of modern science. Rashi says the whole description, the first 6 days of creation, is conceptual. It's referring to some plan of creation. Just like when you build a building, you first of all have a plan of creation in which you think about what the purpose of this is, what do I want to achieve, actually matters more of Torah interest. When you want to build a building, you can't just start building, you think, what sort of space do I want to create, what sort of atmosphere should it feel like, what purpose should the room serve? So similarly, the first 6 days of creation are actually a description of conceptual time, a description of the purpose of creation rather than creation itself. Rashi's radical view. Why we're not taught this when we learn the creation stories at a young age is perhaps a good educational question, but certainly this is how the classic commentators have understood this story, which means to say that even after the writing of the story, actually it's not a description of a scientific explanation of the origins of the world. What do we need to know and understand is that we live in a world which didn't just arise by itself. We live in a world in which ultimately the gift of existence and the gift of life is that has been granted to us by one who transcends physicality. But more than that, it's certainly not from the fundamentals of faith, really, within Judaism.
Yeah. Does anyone want to ask a follow-up question to that? Yeah, go for it. Just wait for the microphone to come to you.
So understandably, science in the Torah is more of a conceptualized kind of idea. But if the first thing written in the Torah is conceptualized and we can't necessarily trust it as how it's written, how do we know that we can trust the rest of the Torah as how it's written, not as just a concept?
I would slightly rephrase what you said, and thank you for your question and allowing me this opportunity. I absolutely do think we should trust the Torah as it's written, but I think we need to be careful readers of the Torah. And this is the point. I don't want to go through text now. I'm happy to find time to do that with you individually. But take out Chumash, look at it, learn it with Rashi, check that we've understood each word accurately, the grammar of each word, what exactly the text is saying. And it isn't just a mythological fairy tale. It's telling us quite clearly what it wants to say. We perhaps don't always notice the nuances of the reading. I'll give you an example, the most famous pasuk of all, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Very familiar to us. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Not a single word in that phrase is an accurate translation. First of all, the word Bereshit. I don't want to go into the grammar too much. Bereshit doesn't mean in the beginning. Grammatically means in the beginning of. So we have a problem in the very first phrase itself. In the beginning of, God created the heaven and the earth. Beginning of what? There's a ... there. In the beginning of, God created the heavens and the earth. And this is something picked up by all the classic commentaries who didn't know their Hebrew grammar. And one of the explanations they give is actually it can't say in the beginning God created, because beginning itself came into existence. In fact, one way of translating the verse is God created, and the object of the sentence is the concept of beginnings, the concept of time itself. Or in the beginning of God created, but the beginning of what? ... of everything. You can't talk about a beginning when beginning itself has been created, because as we explained, with the creation of the world, time came into existence. There was no before. So that's the word Bereshit. Bara, creation, needs unpicking what we mean by the word creation. Something from nothing, a concept that we can't really grasp. The name God's given over here, Elohim. But then in the second chapter of Bereshit, it again repeats the story. This time uses a different name of God. In fact, this is the word that gives Rashi the indicator that what we're referring to is one description of creation, but there's a second description of creation that takes place. Two different descriptions of creation in the Torah. Genesis 1, first chapter of Bereshit, second chapter of Bereshit, repeats the creation story again. Most of us don't notice it because we just, if we do bother reading it, we gallop through it just thinking it's a piece of a novel that doesn't deserve careful thought. Et hashamayim v'et ha'oretz, what's the translation of the word Shemayim va'oretz? What does that mean in Hebrew, the heaven and the earth? Where's heaven, where's earth? And if the earth hasn't yet been created, then what are we referring to? The skies haven't yet been created. In fact, I'll tell you something interesting. When the first man in space was who? Who was the first man in space? Yuri Gagarin, excellent. First man in space. Not first man on the moon, but the Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin. He was quoted when he came back down to Earth as saying, I ascended to the skies, to the heavens, and I didn't see God. Communism was an atheistic philosophy, didn't like religion. And this is what he was quoted as saying, which teaches you that you can be a great cosmonaut, but not a great philosopher or theologian. But that's what he said. It turns out, interestingly, after his death, it isn't what he said. It was what was reported in the media. We now have his diaries, and it turns out he was a religious man. But in Soviet Russia, if you wanted to be a successful scientist or cosmonaut, you kept quite quiet about that. It was actually the Russian propaganda machine that put that out, which simply shows that propagandists, don't make great theologians. But this is what was ascribed to him. Why do we talk about God being in heaven? We talk about fear of heaven or God being in the heavens. It actually comes from a sad mistranslation of a Hebrew word. The word shomayim is etymologically linked to the word shom. Shom means there. That which is over there, not that which is here. Shomayim, the sort of plural form of shomayim, it's not a unique form of plurality, means all the theirs that exist. Shom, everything that is always over there and not here. Everything that is always beyond and not immediately in my grasp. Now, in a physical sense, if I mean it in a physical level, I'm here on earth, and Shemaim is the skies, the heavens, because they always are beyond me. But here it means that which, the literal meaning of the words is that which is beyond. In modern English, we say that which transcends. So the correct translation of the verse is, actually God, particularly the name of God Elohim, in the beginning of, created Shemaim, the realm that transcends physicality, and Oretz, the physical, material universe. We live in a universe in which there's that which is material, that which is physical, and then there's Shomayim, there's that which just transcends and goes beyond that which is physical. And that's very beautiful reading of the Pasuk. We talk about God being in Shomayim because he transcends physicality. He isn't here, he isn't material, he isn't tangible, but he's very much present, but he transcends that which is physical. So we talk about Yirat Shomayim, fear of heaven. Correct translation is awe of that which transcends. As a human being, I should live with Yirat Shamayim, with not fear of the skies, but with awe, with an awareness of the transcendence. I can transcend my physical nature. I don't need to be just a pleasure-seeking animal. I can rise above materialism and selfishness. I can be a being that is aware that I can be beyond myself. And I should live in awe of that with a certain fear. Please God, let me not lose that sensitivity. Please God, let me not lose that which transcends myself. Let me always live with an awareness of myself, not just as an animal, but a transcendent being. And that's part of what the first passage is telling us. So in answer to your question, I think we should trust the text, but we should read it with care.
To stay up to date with JTV content, click subscribe here if you're on YouTube and hit the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, hit the like button, and under following, click see first. If you enjoy watching JTV content and want to help us continue to grow, please consider making a donation to us by clicking here.